DEI as a discipline is so much more expansive than that. There are over 50 plus dimensions of our identity. It's so much deeper than race, gender, sexual orientation, even disability status. When we limit DEI, we do our communities a disservice. Hi, dreamers. Welcome back to the Dreaming Forward podcast for the final episode of this month's topic, which is people, culture, and inclusion. We are exploring topics that I discuss in my book, Evolution to Equity. We've talked about what is people, culture, and inclusion, or as I call it, PCI for short. Then we spent time talking about people, which focuses on human resources. We also talked about culture, which focuses on organizational development, or OD for short. And today's episode, I want to cap off the month discussing DEI, or diversity, equity, and inclusion. And that is the I in PCI. DEI has been at the top of public discourse for about 4 years now. And some of the conversation has been unproductive. But to be honest, I actually have liked much of the arguments, the discourse, because it is forcing us to confront what we want to believe about ourselves versus how we actually practice that self. And I think that that's always a very healthy practice because we can lie to a lot of things and a lot of people, but it's really dangerous when we lie to ourselves. A lot of the discussion around DEI stems from conversations around race, anti-racism, gender equity, and sexual orientation, and the ways in which we protect and espouse the humanity of the LGBTQ plus community. However, DEI as a discipline is so much more expansive than that. And one of the first things that I discuss in my book is around the dimensions of identity. And it's a framework that I've created that I share in graphic form. There are over 50 plus dimensions of our identity that all of us are living at the exact same time. It's so much deeper than race, gender, sexual orientation, even disability status. It gets into everything from birth order to our attachment style, to our trauma history, to the political leanings, and even, yes, political party affiliation. When we limit DEI to only 8 dimensions and the traits within those dimensions, we not only do ourselves a disservice, but we do our communities a disservice. And most important, we do our companies a disservice because we're guaranteed to have blind spots. We are guaranteed to miss important aspects of human identity. And finally, we miss important aspects of the human experience. So I want to talk today about the 4 key aspects of DEI practice and DEI theory. So how we think about it theoretically, and then how we actually put in the work to create inclusive cultures in our workplace and in the world around us. There are 4 key areas of DEI, and they are community, culture, product, and marketing. And again, in the book, I represent them graphically, and I also take the time to list very particular business activities that you can do in each of the 4 areas. But I want to take some time today, and I'll set this to the side. I want to take some time today to think about those 4 areas. Community is one of the hot button issues in DEI because community deals with the people in our ecosystem. So these are the candidates who go out for jobs in our company. It is our employees, our leaders, our vendors. So we think about the people who we have contracts with to provide services and products. That is usually the part that we're hearing a lot of pushback about, because we hear about, oh, it should be a meritocracy and it's all about what you can do and your capabilities. But that ignores how important our identity is to not just how we show up in the world, but how the world shows up for us and with us and through us. When we think about who gets to have access to the compounding experiences that lead to a meritocracy, we can't help but recognize all of the biases that are present there. So I'll take my own life as an example. I am obviously a Black woman, and y'all know I've talked at length about the fact that I'm from Detroit, Michigan, proudly. What up, though? But even though I am a Black woman who is from Detroit, My experiences attending magnet schools gave me a very different worldview, a different level of access that impacts my life even now. And I talk about that in the book. My early experiences, and I mean as early as third and fourth grade, with being able to understand college preparatory activities, going on college visits in middle school, taking the SAT and ACT for practice to go to these enrichment programs, it set me on a course that I'm still benefiting from today. And there are people, even in my own family, who did not have access to some of those same things. And while they have found a path to thrive, my path was so much more efficient than theirs. And that is the case across many different lived experiences. So there are people who may have lost their parents early and went into foster care. And as a result of being in foster care, there are certain experiences that they missed that may have led to them approaching their work in a particular way. So maybe it took them a little longer to get things that other people got in 19 and 20. So could we look at them with the same level of scrutiny as somebody who may have had access to a ton of things? It could be the case based on where you were born and lived. If you grew up in a rural environment where you had limited access to broadband internet versus if you lived in an urban area where it was filled with access to all of these resources to do research and find career paths and access to mentors and sponsors. So again, that community aspect is so much more expansive than we've been taught to look at. And we love sound bites in popular culture. I do it. I mean, obviously I got this podcast, so I pick a clip and I think it's the clip that's gonna get the most attention. But the danger of sound bites is that we are not built for a bite of information. We thrive, we find meaning in sitting with things and feeling and processing and thinking about them deeply. And the way we speak about people's lived experiences and DEI at large in the public square, whether that is in the media, on social media, even in our own small little communities, it's these little bite-sized pieces. And so it's the equivalent to us eating Snickers or Reese's minis rather than sitting down to have a full meal. And just like you would not be able to live and thrive off of candy bars, little bite-sized candy bars for the rest of your life, we need the meat and the gravity and the depth of a full meal of discourse around diversity, equity, and inclusion, which leads to a conversation about culture. So when we think about culture and DEI, these are often the intangibles. So I mentioned in the last episode about OD interventions and how OD has such a significant impact on communication. When we think about who gets to be heard, seen, recognized, and rewarded for their contributions, who gets a chance to contribute, who gets a chance to show, the conversation around equity becomes even more prominent because there are tons of people who we have been taught are not capable of showing up to the party, but if we're honest, they were never even invited. When we think about who gets to even fail. So to fail at something, you had to have a chance to be in the conversation. You had a chance to compete. You had a chance to be present. And I think we take for granted the fact that not everybody gets that. Not everybody even gets a chance to see if they could succeed or fail. To be honest, I think for some folks that's kind of by design. Like if we think about the ideas that drive many of us to believe that we are excellent, it is often in the comparison of others. So I know that I am excellent at my work in part because of what I perceive as a lack of excellence in others, whether that's true or not. But that perception is what gives me the ego boost of saying I am good. And if we are honest, especially in the workplace, we are able to feel good about it because the number of competitors who we get to see or get to compete against is relatively small. When I think about most of the jobs that I've had, so I'm a white collar employee, have been my entire career, most of my peers are equally as educated, come from similar social backgrounds, similar social circles in terms of the types of conversations that are happening, access to information, even hobbies in many cases. I am not competing against everyone who could potentially do this job. And so when we start saying things like, oh, well, let's eliminate college degree requirements, let's eliminate uh, the strict requirements on years of experience, let's pull from these different communities who normally haven't been considered for this job. It feels threatening to some of us because we've been taught that excellence is based on these very limited parameters to begin with. And so that's a culture issue because maybe our lens of what excellence, of what productivity, of what performance looks like was way too small to begin with. And what happens when we widen that lens, not only do we get to see how much we've missed, but we also see how small we are. All right, I'm gonna move off that one. Let's talk about marketing in DEI. Who gets to be seen and pitched to buy your product? I saw this recently. It probably was it last year. It was an American Express commercial, and in this American Express commercial, it was a Black woman who was like on vacations in an affinity pool, and she was doing all these amazing things. And it was playing either during the NBA playoffs or the finals. It was some prestigious event or prominent event with the NBA. And I remember thinking, I've never seen anything like this. First of all, I don't know if prior to that I had ever really even seen Black people, and especially a Black woman, in an American Express commercial. Because if you think about in terms of like credit worthiness in the credit card sphere, Amex is like the highest you can get. Like everybody can't qualify but no Amex. And so then to see this representation of this Black woman doing all these amazing things, I was like, oh, they're recognizing that Black women have disposable income and are willing to spend it. Because nobody is going to invest in marketing if they don't think that you're going to be a buyer. That's just not how marketing works. So to now see companies be more intentional about diversifying their marketing targets, that is fascinating. And part of the fascination is what happens when you now become desirable. So if you think about who normally pops up in commercials for luxury cars, who normally pops up in billboards or magazine ads for luxury watches or fine dining restaurants or spas, what's their race? What's their gender? What color is their hair? How long is their hair? What's their body type? Are they plus size? Are they very slender? Are they curvy and maybe have a little bit more of a voluptuous figure? Or do they have more of a lean figure to them? Are they smoking cigarettes? What color are their eyes? What's their eye shape? Right? All of these features and elements factor into how important and desirable do you seem to be to that company's bottom line. And there are some companies where they have been dinged for pandering. So, and this is no shade to them at all, but this comes up because it pops up in social media like every year, where McDonald's had that commercial where the man it was like a thunderstorm out and he's rapping slash singing. It's almost like a like a 2000s R&B like pop locking type thing, and he it's like, girl, you got a 10-piece, so don't be stingy or something like that. But anyway, we laugh at it, but it was just so clear. It's like, okay, they're marketing this to Black folks, like Black urban. You probably young at that point as a millennial. We would have been like in our 20s, so y'all marketing that to us. But when you have the one where it's the sing-songy, almost like lullaby chime, and it's the kid playing in the back of a minivan, is that still for us? Who is that for? And what do those families represent? When you have the commercials where they purposely make someone racially ambiguous, so you can't tell if they're a light-skinned Black person, if they biracial, if they're Hispanic. I don't know, they might be South Asian. We don't know. But we just know that they're a person of color. It seems inclusive, but what does that mean for me as a person who has a very distinct identity? Again, there are over 50 dimensions of identity. And so the show Bridgerton actually comes to mind. And this kind of transitions into thinking about product marketing too, because every season it's like a different mix of races and skin tones and styles and all of those things. And a part of The appeal to Bridgerton is that it feels like fantasy, because there's no way that this level of diversity and difference could coexist. And I think that as much as I love the show and think that it's amazing that Netflix over-indexed in making sure that they brought this very diverse cast, I can't help but wonder what it says about us as a society that that level of diversity would seem as much like fantasy as the world of Lord of the Rings, where you got hobbits and dwarves, right? Like, it's that uncommon for us to see different races and ethnicities coexisting together and enjoying each other and building community, as it is for the dwarf and the elf to get along. Like, what does that really say about us? And I think those are the conversations that we're afraid to have. Those are the things that we're afraid to admit about ourselves, because we, and I say we because I'm included in this, we are very good at pretending that our biases are justified. But the truth is, we all have the capacity to be marginalized or to marginalize others across any of the dimensions. And I talk about this a lot in my trainings. Even as a Black woman, I absolutely can marginalize others based on everything from sexual orientation to caregiver status. So as somebody that's child free, I can easily marginalize somebody that has kids with being like, oh, why don't they have time for that? What do you mean? Because I don't necessarily have those limitations on time. It could go the other way too, where if I'm not a mom in the group or don't have the responsibility of caring for someone, people think, oh, she ain't got nothing to do. She should be able to. You don't know that. I might have some other outside hobbies. So marginalization is not a static measurement. It is something that is relative. And if we are not well versed in our own identity's complexity, we will easily marginalize others while also thriving off of a sense of perpetual victimhood due to our own marginalization. So yes, I can be very upset about the ways in which I experience bias as a Black woman. But I don't want nobody to touch on the fact that, like, sometimes you got a little bit of phobia based on 3-4 things too. And again, this goes back to what I said at the beginning, because our conversation about DEI is so narrow. If we're not talking about our narrow view of bias, privilege, power, influence, marginalization, then we don't want to talk about it, period. We only want to stay in our own little lane, and that's not how this works. So finally, with product inclusion, is your product made for everyone? And what does that mean? If it's not made for everyone, which most things are not, what is the cost of leaving someone out? Who gets left out? Why are they left out? How do we make them feel when they're left out of it? So even with this podcast supposes that you have access to the internet, that you have an understanding of how to use social media and apps to get to YouTube, that you have some level of literacy because you can read to be able to see or recognize the symbols to hit play, to find it, to search for it, right? And what if all of those things are not true? So what if I am an illiterate man who lives off the grid? What is the cost of them not getting the information that I present in this podcast? And is it worth it to me to exclude them? Now, that might seem like an extreme example, but what happens when it's something like bread or milk? What happens when the product is access to job applications? What happens when the product is access to healthcare? What happens when the product is access to reading resources and literacy resources? All of us have to look at the ways in which we exclude others, and then also look at the ways in which we disproportionately benefit from being included. So I talked about this a couple years ago. It was around the time when I first bought my home. You know, I would always hate on like HOAs and all these people. They got all these rules. And I was like, oh my goodness, now I've become like that crotchety old neighbor who was like, don't walk on my lawn. Don't do this. What else people doing? Because now it's something that I hold dear and that is near and dear to my heart. This is my first property and I worked really hard to qualify for a mortgage. And how no, you should be doing this, and why isn't it like this? But just a year ago, I was on the other side of that. And what did that look like when people felt like I didn't care about my neighborhood because I was a renter? How do you know that? How do you know that that's true? What does that mean? And again, that's why I said marginalization is not a static measurement, it's fluid. And we have to always be checking ourselves to understand the ways in which our products, our services, what we offer to the world, how that excludes people, the feelings behind that, and how we benefit from inclusion in a product's benefits. Because everybody is not going to benefit in the same way. And even if you aren't willing to change that, like I wouldn't expect Rolex to be like, oh yeah, let's make, a lower price point watch. Like we're just gonna make entry level watches. No, Rolex is Rolex. But they do have to be open to critique and at least aware of the critiques that will come as a result of them being that exclusive. In thinking about DEI as a part of the PCI discussion, the last thing that I want to just say and leave as a question for you is, in your own workplace, whether you are an employee and you're an individual contributor, a people manager, a leader, an executive, or even the founder or CEO, what does it mean for you to be included? And what does it mean for you to be excluded? How do you feel when you're included versus how do you feel when you are excluded? All right, drop it for me in the comments. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe. And as always, it's a pleasure. I can't wait for next month. Y'all gonna really enjoy what I got coming up for September and October. So be sure again to like, share, and subscribe. Share it with others, and I will catch you in the next one. Bye, dream.